7, Examples for Business Finance. So in Chapter 7, we look at dividend stock price calculations using the dividend growth model. And we look at that here. So we have the price of a stock equals the amount of the next dividend times 1 plus the growth rate divided by the required rate of return minus growth rate. So we have information here about a stock that's just paid a dividend of $2.59. We have the growth rate and the required rate of return. So for the stock price today, that calculation is just this dividend times 1 plus the growth rate. So 1 plus our 3.9%. Oh, and we need to make sure we have parentheses around that, and then divided by the rate of return minus the growth rate. So at year 1, it's $40.76. For future years, we need to calculate that growth happens for a number of years. And what we need to do is we need to calculate what the present value is of the future payments. So what we have here then at year 3, we have the price from year 1 times 1 plus the growth rate to the power of 3 years. And for year 15, we have the original price of $40.76 times 1 plus the growth rate to the power of the number of years, so 15 years. So that works when there is constant growth. So at year 0, our price is $40.76. At year 3, it's $45.72, and at year 15, it's $72.36. In example 2, we're trying to figure out the required rate of return from the information that we have about the dividend paid, the dividend growth rate, and the price today. So we can still use our dividend growth model, we just need to rearrange the model. So our required rate of return, or R, equals the dividend paid divided by the price plus the growth. So we have here then the required rate of return is our dividend paid of $2.65 divided by today's price plus our dividend growth rate of 4.5%. So we have a required rate of return of 10.64%. In our next example, we're looking for the dividend yield and the capital gains yield. So the dividend yield is the dividend paid divided by the required return. So dividend yield is dividend paid divided by our required return. So our dividend yield is 6.14%. The capital gains yield is the same as the dividend growth rate. So that just equals the dividend growth rate. The capital gains yield and the dividend growth rate are the same figure. In our next example, we have constant growth rate, or a dividend growth rate of 4.3% and dividend yield of 5.6%. We want to know what the required rate of return on the company's stock is. So the formula for required rate of return is dividend growth rate, or capital gain, plus the dividend yield. So for the required rate of return, we're going to add these two together. So our required rate of return is 9.9%. In our next example, we know that a company's stock is currently selling for $67 per share with a required return of 10.8%. We also know that the total return is evenly divided between capital gains yield and the dividend yield. So it's the company's policy to always maintain constant growth rate in its dividends. What is the current dividend per share? So knowing the constant growth rate, we can use the growth model to calculate this. What we need to know about our dividend yield then is that it is half of the required rate of return. So we know that our dividend yield is the required rate of return divided by 2. And our growth rate then, or the capital gains yield, is the required rate of return divided by 2. So now we have our growth rate information, and we know the required rate of return. So the next year's dividend is, so we use the growth rate times the stock price to come up with next year's dividend. Then our current dividend is next year's dividend divided by the growth rate. One plus the growth rate. So our current dividend is 3.34 and next year's dividend is 3.62. In our next example, we are trying to calculate the growth rate. So we have information about the stock price, the required return, and the amount of the dividend paid. So we just rearrange our equation again. So the growth rate equals the dividend paid, the most recent dividend paid, divided by the price. So required rate of return minus the dividend paid divided by the price. So we can use this information here to get our growth rate. So we have the required rate of return minus the dividend paid divided by the price. So our growth rate for the stock is 4.16%. The next example that we're going to look at has a stock that is going to pay a dividend in the future, but not until 20 years in the future. So we want to know how much we would pay today, given the fact that it's not going to pay a dividend for 20 years. When we have a stock that pays no dividends for 20 years, once it starts paying dividends, it will have the same dividends forever. We have to value the stock at the point that it starts paying dividends. So we need to know what the price is in 19 years. So we need to know what the dividend 20 years from now is going to be. So the price in 19 years is the dividend, which will be $20, divided by our required rate of return. So that's the preferred stock model or the perpetuity model. So our price in 19 years is going to be this dividend of $20 divided by the required rate of return. The price today, we need to take it back So the present value. So the price today is the present value of our price in 19 years, and then it's divided by 1 plus the required rate of return to the number of years, and it's the number of years minus 1. So we're going to take the number of years, 20 years, minus 1. And we've gotten then the present value. So the price today would be $71.83. In this next example, we have a dividend of $2.64 next year, and we're going to maintain a rate of growth for 4.5%. So this is just our dividend growth model, except we're looking at one is if we want 12% growth, how much is the price? And the other one is if we want 8% growth, how much is the price? So the price is equals the dividend paid divided by the required rate of return minus the growth rate, or G. So R minus G. D divided by R minus G. So at 12%, that is our dividend paid divided by the required rate of return of 12 minus our growth rate, or $35.20. At a required rate of return of 8%, we have the dividend paid divided by the required rate of return of 8% minus the dividend growth rate. So at a required return of 8%, the price today is $75.43, and at 12%, it's $35.20. A higher required return means that the stock will sell for a lower price. In this example, we're going to use a little bit different calculations than we've been using before. So before we were using the dividend growth model. Well, some companies don't pay dividends. And so we have to use different numbers to estimate their stock price. And so we can use their earnings per share and a benchmark PE. In that case, the formula is price equals benchmark PE ratio times the EPS, or earnings per share. So at a PE, remember that's the price earnings ratio, and the EPS is the earnings per share. So we're just revisiting formulas from chapter 3 are also being used in this chapter. So for the price of the stock, we take the earnings per share times the PE ratio, or the price earnings ratio. And the difference between a price earnings ratio of 21 and a price earnings ratio of 18 gives us a difference in our stock price. So remember, the price earnings ratio is the price of a stock divided by the earnings per share. In this example, we are doing unequal growth. So we have non-constant growth. Over the next 4 years, we're going to have different dividend amounts. And then after that, the company is going to maintain a constant percent growth rate in dividends forever. So what we have to do is first, we have to calculate the stock price in year 4 using the constant growth model. And then we need to do the present value of each of the dividends to get the share price for today. So with the non-constant dividends, first we're going to do the stock price in year 4 using the dividend growth model. So that is the dividend in year 4 times 1 plus the growth rate. Remember, then it's that amount divided by the required return minus the growth rate. Just that dividend growth model. The most recent dividend times 1 plus the growth rate divided by the return minus the growth rate. So that gives us our stock price in year 4, which is $63.19. Then we need to do the present value of each one of the shares. So we start with dividend 1. So the dividend in year 1 divided by 1 plus the required return plus dividend 2 divided by 1 plus the required return, but this is to 2 years in year 2 plus the dividend in year 3 divided by 1 plus the required return to the power of 3 then for year 3. Close my parentheses. Plus the year 4 price divided by 1 plus the required rate of return to 4 years. So the share price today will be $72.92.